Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are setting the stage for one of the longest-lasting, most influential empires the world has ever known.
The Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. But we are deliberately ignoring the famous sultans for now. We're not talking about the grand conquests, the Siege of Vienna, or the splendor of the court under figures like Suleiman the Magnificent.
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet. We are taking a much deeper look back. We're going to the late 13th century, to the very moment of its unlikely birth.
And our mission today is really to travel to Anatolia, what you might know as Asia Minor, and to understand the structural conditions there. It was a state of, frankly, absolute chaos.
Right.
And this is so important because the rise of the Ottoman Empire was not some inevitable march of destiny. Yeah. It wasn't preordained.
No.
It emerged from this chaotic power vacuum, a time of anarchy so profound that it made the success of a small, flexible power not guaranteed, but merely possible.
And to really get the Ottomans, you first have to understand that broken world they inherited. So we're talking about a landscape that was, utterly fragmented. You've called it a shatter zone.
That's the perfect term for it. Politically decentralized and just uniquely suited for a small group of ambitious pastoralists to thrive where these older, grander empires had failed.
And for this deep dive, we've gone through the sources to build a picture of what late 13th century life was actually like, from the big political fractures caused by the Mongols all the way down to the specific ideological glue that held the very first Osmanlis together.
To set the scene, we have to start with the political giant whose shadow was still, lingering over the entire region.
The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum.
Exactly. This powerful Turco-Persian state had dominated central Anatolia for centuries. But by the time our narrative begins, in the late 1200s, that dominance was fading fast.
And the sources are really specific about this timeline, aren't they? When we first meet the early Osmanlis, the tribe of Osman, they're living in their humble settlement at Suzut.
Right. And their existence is described as almost slothful.
Slothful, which is such a great word.
It is. And it's a deliberate contrast, this quiet pastoral life set against the great political turmoil happening all around them with the Seljuk disappearance. And it's important to get what disappearance means here. It wasn't a single event. It wasn't like a decisive battle where one ruler gets replaced by another.
The Seljuks didn't just vanish overnight.
No, their power just shattered. It broke apart primarily due to these huge external pressures that I'm sure we'll get into.
The Mongols.
And what resulted was an absolute collapse of any kind of central authority. This created a highly decentralized, highly contested landscape. And this, right here, is the crucial foundation for the entire Ottoman story. It all starts with fragmentation.
But a contested landscape doesn't mean it's a total free-for-all with no rules.
Not at all.
It meant that while let's say, the military might and the centralized administration of the Seljuks were gone, the idea of authority and critically political and religious legitimacy, that remained extremely valuable.
Absolutely. That's a key point.
Yeah.
You couldn't just be a new contender who conquers some land and declares yourself sultan. That wouldn't work.
You needed a story.
You needed a story, an ideological framework to justify why you should replace the Seljuks. You had to claim a raison d'etre, reason for being, that went beyond just brute force.
So if you're one of these dozens of emerging small Turkish emirates, what historians call the beyliks, you've got a few things on your to-do list beyond just fighting.
Right. Military conquest is one thing, but you also have to establish your legitimacy, and you have to ensure you can survive in a world where, frankly, everyone is fighting everyone else.
So how did they do that? How did they try to prove they were legitimate?
Well, there were a few paths. The new beyliks, they sought legitimacy either through, say, claims of religious superiority, being the one true Ghazi, the holy warriors for Islam.
The frontier ideal.
The ultimate frontier ideal. Or they'd use strategic marital alliances, marrying into the remnants of powerful neighboring houses, maybe even families with some distant Seljuk lineage.
Anything to get a little bit of that old prestige.
Exactly. You needed to signal to your rivals, and maybe more importantly to your own people, that your rule was destined, that it wasn't just an accident of history.
Because that power vacuum, it wasn't really empty. It was filled with all these historical claims, these ideological competitions, which I guess is what made the political maneuvering of the first Ottomans so critical to their long-term success.
It's everything. Their success was political as much as it was military.
And you can't discuss this chaos in Anatolia in the 13th and 14th centuries without talking about the elephant in the room.
The overarching shadow of the Mongol world system. specifically the Ilkhanid Mongols, who had effectively turned the Seljuks into a vassal state. They were ruling indirectly.
Now, our sources, since they're focused on the early Ottomans, they might be a bit thin on the day-to-day details of 13th century Mongol governance.
They are, but we can look at the historical impact of what the Mongols did, especially later Turco-Mongol actions, to understand the kind of political dynamics they created.
Which was what?
Their presence guaranteed that no single local Anatolian power could consolidate for very long. The enforced fragmentation.
And there's a perfect historical case study for this, isn't there? It happens a bit later, but it shows the dynamic perfectly.
The invasion by Timur, or Tamerlane, in 1402, another great Turco-Mongol leader. This event is, it's devastating for the Ottomans, who by then were quite established, but it beautifully demonstrates the endemic weakness of central power in Anatolia.
So let's just lay out that shock. By 1402, you have Sultan Bayezid I. His nickname is Yildirim the Thunderbolt.
Right, because he moved so fast in his conquest.
And he is utterly routed, defeated and captured by Timur at the Battle of Ankara. And this isn't just some temporary setback. This defeat throws the entire established Ottoman Empire into a catastrophic, decade-long civil war.
The Ottoman interregnum. From 1402 to 1413, a total meltdown.
But what's most instructive, as you said, is what Timur does next, his political strategy after the victory.
Exactly. He doesn't just defeat the Sultan. He intentionally, systematically undoes all the centralizing work the Ottomans had spent decades building.
He starts putting the old rulers back in charge.
He restores the deposed emirs, or their heirs, to their respective beyliks all across Asia Minor.
He essentially hits the reset button on Anatolian politics.
That's the perfect way to put it. He resurrects all these rivals that Bayezid had spent years conquering. Karamania, Teke, Menteşe, Sarukan, Aydin, Kastamuni. The list goes on.
And this wasn't random. It was a deliberate act of structural fragmentation.
Completely deliberate. Timur wanted a fractured, weak Anatolia on his western flank. He did not want a unified, powerful neighbor like the Ottomans had become.
Okay, so that tells us two really crucial things about the world the first Ottomans grew up in. First, the power of these other beyliks, it was rooted in something real, a genuine historical regional legitimacy that could just be revived. They weren't just temporary bandit gangs.
No, they had deep roots. And the second thing?
The second thing is that central power, even the impressive centralized machine that Bayezid had built, was inherently fragile. It could be shattered by a massive external military shock of the Mongol type.
And that's the paradox. These Mongol-type incursions, they created periods of absolute anarchy. They destroyed states, they destabilized society, but they also guaranteed that the political landscape remained perpetually decentralized.
The game was constantly being reset.
Constantly. Every time one power grew a little too large, it could be shattered by an external force, which guaranteed that there was always an opportunity for the next small, flexible, ambitious power to rise up and pick up the pieces.
Like the early Ottomans.
Precisely like the early Ottomans. So the pressure from the East didn't just weaken the Seljuks one time, it institutionalized a whole cycle of fragmentation. And that cycle provided the perfect breeding ground for dynamic new states, as long as they were nimble enough to survive the periodic shockwaves.
So this brings us right to the reality on the ground in the late 13th century. You have the beyliks.
The dozens of small competing Turkish emirates that spring up to fill that specific political vacuum left by the Seljuks. They were sovereign, yet constantly contested mini-states.
And when we say dozens, that number is actually pretty staggering. Just shows how fractured this political reality was.
It really was. We have traveler writers like Ibn Battuta and Shehabeddin, and they visited the region during the reign of Orkhan, who was Osman's son. This is around, say, 1330 to 1350.
And what did they find?
They recorded over 26 independent Turkish emirates, all existing at the same time.
26.
26. And that level of local competition meant that the early Osmanlis, the Ottomans, they were initially just one small player on an incredibly crowded board.
They weren't special at the beginning.
Not at all. You had rivals like Aydin, Karasi, Kastamuni, Menteş, and Teke, all struggling for regional dominance. But the most persistent, perhaps the strongest rival of all,
Was Karaman.
was Karaman, yes. They often controlled territory and military resources that either matched or, frankly, exceeded what the early Ottomans had.
And this is a really critical point that the sources stress, and one that I think often gets lost in the later story of Ottoman glory. The Ottomans were absolutely not the strongest beylik at the outset. If this story were simply about the strongest Turkish group conquering the weakest, Karaman probably should have absorbed the Osmanlis.
They should have. But they didn't. And the Ottoman difference, the thing that set them apart, was a strategic pivot that allowed them to transcend all that internal fighting, that internecine warfare that was plaguing all the Anatolian beyliks.
They looked west.
They looked west. They focused their expansion across the Dardanelles and into Europe, or what they called Rumelia.
And the sources say they became masters of the entire Balkan Peninsula before they had even subjugated Asia Minor, as far as Konya, the old Seljuk capital.
Yeah.
Which seems so counterintuitive. Why would you go and conquer this difficult, distant territory first, instead of just consolidating power in your own backyard?
Because it was a brilliant strategic move, born out of geopolitical necessity. And that westward expansion achieved three things that their Anatolian rivals just could not match.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, prestige. Conquering Christians, the Gaza ideal in action, was the most potent form of political and religious legitimacy you could get in that era.
It was great marketing.
The best. It drew enthusiastic warriors to their banner from all over Anatolia. It gave them this constant influx of fighting men that their locally focused rivals like Karaman simply couldn't attract.
Okay, that's one. Prestige, what's number two?
Two is wealth. The Byzantines and Balkan states, though they were deeply fractured, were much richer targets for plunder and for tribute than fighting with Karaman over, limited Anatolian pasture land.
Right.
And that revenue, that new wealth, is what funded their growing administrative state. And three, and this is maybe the most important, manpower. By shifting their focus to Europe, they institutionalized a really crucial mechanism for loyalty and military strength. This is where we see the early application of systems like the color, the centralized slave family administration, and the devshirme.
Okay, let's unpack the devshirme system for a minute, because the sources really stress the importance of this foreign manpower. Now, it became more formalized later, but the basic practice of acquiring non-Muslim boys as a levy or a tax was foundational to this whole European focus.
It was absolutely foundational. The devshirme was, at its core, a system of human tribute. He was the levy of boys, taken primarily from Christian populations in the Balkans.
And what did that do for the Sultan?
It ensured he had a constant, fresh supply of manpower for two key areas: his elite military corps, the janissaries, and his highest administrative positions.
And crucially, these boys, they were separated from their biological families, their cultural roots. They were raised as fiercely loyal Muslims, and their entire existence was dependent on the Sultan.
It's the ultimate loyalty program. They couldn't form rival power centers back in Anatolia because they had no origin there. They had no inherited land, no titles, no local family ties.
They were the Sultan's slaves, his color, and that ensured absolute central control.
So by using this European prestige and this non-Anatolian source of manpower, the Ottomans created a military and administrative machine that was just structurally superior to their neighbors. They essentially outflanked the other beyliks by mastering the Balkans first.
And then they used that European advantage to turn back and eventually dominate their stronger, more entrenched Anatolian rivals like Karaman.
It was a masterful long game.
So now let's zoom in even further, right down to the ground level. The specific environment of the early Osmanlis at their settlement in Suzit. Their origin story is remarkably humble. A simple, pastoral folk led by a man named Ertugrul with only about 400 fighting men. This paints a picture so far removed from the imperial grandeur that would follow.
It's a true frontier existence, a local border region life. And the sources offer this fascinating counter-narrative to the idea we have of just relentless conflict.
What's that?
They note that the initial relationship the Osmanis had with their immediate neighbors was often one of perfect amity.
Perfect amity. That's a profound detail.
It is, isn't it? It suggests that right on the immediate frontier, survival was often based on pragmatic neighborhood relations, on trade, on local alliances. It wasn't purely about constant religious or ethnic conflict.
You had to coexist to survive.
You had to. But that coexistence could only take them so far. For the Osmanlis to transition from being just a small pastoral tribe into a conquering state, they needed an ideological catalyst. Something more. And the decisive turning point was the conversion of Osman and his tribe, which effectively gave birth to the Osmanli people. It welded together all these different elements, Turkish, Muslim, even newly converted Christians, into a new race with a very clear raison d'etre.
And that reason for being, it was immediately cemented by a mystical claim to sovereignty.
Osman's dream.
Osman's dream. This is what provided the necessary religious legitimacy, elevating him above the status of just another local chieftain.
And this dream is the foundation myth. It's designed to be politically and spiritually compelling. The story goes that a moon, representing the daughter of a revered dervish master named Sheikh Edebali,
Right, a very powerful spiritual figure.
very powerful. This moon rises from the sheikh's breast and enters Osman's. And then, from Osman's navel, a massive tree springs up, and its shade covers the entire world.
And Sheikh Edebali interprets this as a prophecy.
He does. He says it means God is granting sovereignty to Osman and to all of his descendants. And the results were immediate and incredibly effective politically.
It led directly to Osman's marriage to Edebali's daughter.
Unifying political leadership with spiritual authority in one move.
Yeah.
And it solidified his solemn dedication to Gaza.
Holy war against the infidel.
Exactly. And Gaza became the rallying cry. It provided the legal and religious justification for expanding into Christian lands, and it drew a highly motivated population to the Ottoman borders. This frontier world was a real melting pot, driven by opportunity, by faith, and by social mobility.
So who exactly was drawn to this volatile, ambitious frontier? What kind of people showed up?
All sorts. You had the warriors, of course, driven by the ideal of Gaza and, let's be honest, the promise of land and loot.
Sure.
But you also had a really essential spiritual element. The dervishes, the Sufi masters, often organized into various orders, who provided the underlying religious culture of the frontier.
And the sources highlight a critical internal contrast here. It's the dervishes versus the ulema.
Yes, the ulema being the formal, orthodox Islamic legal and religious scholars. The dervishes provided something very different, a highly flexible, attractive, and often tolerant version of Islam that was perfect for a multi-ethnic frontier where conversion and compromise were just daily realities.
Awesome.
Well, they were known for their simplicity, their humility, and a focus on inner spiritual experience over rigid outward piety.
And they sometimes intentionally flouted the norms, didn't they? Like shaving their beards or eyebrows.
Yes, specifically to distinguish themselves from the formal, dogmatic ulema. They saw the ulema's rigid interpretations and their intolerance as often leading to local calamities or alienating potential new converts.
And that flexibility would have been crucial on the frontier.
It was. The dervish influence made the new Ottoman regime spiritually palatable to this incredibly diverse population, which included recently converted Christians or people who just chose pragmatism over religious conflict. The dervishes provided the spiritual infrastructure, and the Ghazi warriors provided the military muscle.
And the reward for joining this new identity, no matter where you came from, was unheard of social mobility.
And that meritocracy was the real engine of their growth. The sources describe the future Ottoman ruling institution as a daring experiment that just broke all conventional social barriers of the time.
It would take, and I'm quoting here, slaves born Christians and boys from the plowtail, people with no lineage, no inherited wealth, and elevate them to the highest administrative posts in the empire, even Grand Vizier.
The system simply asked one question: are you worthy?
Which was a radical contrast to the feudal aristocracies that dominated Europe and, for that matter, the often entrenched conservative Turkish beyliks. This promise of a matchless path of human glory was just magnetic.
Absolutely.
So to understand how the Osmanlis financed all this ambition, we have to ground them in their physical and economic world.
Right, geography dictates survival. And for them, that meant two things: proximity to the fragmented but still wealthy Byzantine Empire, and control over the vital east-west trade route.
And if you control those routes, you control the flow of goods, and you get to collect the taxes.
Which requires stable infrastructure. Even at this early beylik level, we see the importance of caravanserais.
These are the roadside inns.
Exactly. Designed to facilitate trade, protect merchants, and, of course, collect tolls and taxes along the major routes. They were key economic resources that fueled political aspiration.
So if we look at the kind of stable economic framework they were trying to build, we should probably look at the land tenure system, which was emerging at this time, right? Drawing on older Seljuk and Byzantine models.
Yes, it was a system designed to link local administration, military service, and revenue generation all into one package.
And it all hinged on one figure, the Sipahi.
The feudal cavalryman, correct.
Oh.
In this system, the land was technically owned by the Sultan, but the Sipahi held a tamar, which is a kind of fief, in return for his military service.
So it wasn't hereditary wealth, it was more like a salary paid in land.
Precisely. The Sipahi acted as the government's local representative. He ensured order, and he collected the revenue.
And what revenue was that? What were people paying?
The essential stream was the tithe, a share of the agricultural produce, so typically grain or other staples, collected in kind from the peasant households. This was the primary income for the Sipahi to maintain himself, his horse, his equipment, and his retinue for war.
And there was a cash tax, too.
Yes. On top of that, every peasant household holding a sift, a specific measurement of land, paid an annual tax of 22 axes, or silver coins, to the Sipahi.
So military service, land tenure, and tax collection are all woven together in this local, decentralized administrative structure.
It was the mechanism that allowed the Ottoman center to govern vast territories without needing a massive, modern-style bureaucracy.
And you see this framework for stability mirrored in their urban life as well. Even the small Ottoman towns had a clear functional structure reflecting the goals of the state: order, commerce, and defense.
A very clear blueprint. The town center was reserved for business, administration, and defense. This was the domain of the Muslim ruling elite, wielding civil and religious authority. It's where you'd find the congregational mosque, the government buildings, and the main market.
But right from the start, economic life was diverse. The town center always included Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and foreign merchants.
A vital economic specialization. These non-Muslim communities often controlled the long-distance commerce that brought real wealth and resources into the region.
And around the center, you had the residential quarters.
The mahallis, yes. They formed a ring around the business center, and they were characterized by these low dwellings, narrow, meandering streets, often separated by large gardens, which gave the towns a more sprawling, less dense feel than you might imagine.
And the public infrastructure, what it tells us about the culture, is fascinating. The sources specifically call the bathhouse a key resource of any Muslim city. What role did it play beyond just hygiene?
They were critical social institutions. Pre-modern Muslim travelers considered a functioning mosque, a market, and a bathhouse as the three things necessary to define a place as a city.
So they were that important.
Absolutely. The bathhouses were public spaces for relaxation, for entertainment, for social interaction, separate from the home and the market. And crucially, they were one of the primary public spaces available to women, who were generally restricted from the male-dominated coffeehouses and public markets.
That gives you a real window into the daily social constraints and, I guess, the releases of that era.
It does. And culturally, that foundational Turkic heritage remained incredibly strong, especially in their military tradition.
Warfare and physical prowess were revered.
Absolutely. And you see this in the importance of archery, which was viewed as the most important sport. The Turks have this deep history as master archers going all the way back to Central Asia. This skill was practiced rigorously, even long after firearms were introduced, which just highlights their reverence for that martial tradition.
And you also see the early structure of community building in their commitment to things like education.
Yes, the primary schools, the Sibian Mektepleri, were often established through charitable endowments and located right within a mosque complex. The goal was pretty straightforward: teach reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and the core principles of Islam.
A system built for cultural resilience.
It was. And while the teachers were often imams or muezzins, educated women who had memorized the Quran were also eligible to teach in the schools for girls. It shows a community that's laying the foundations not just for conquest, but for long-term cultural and administrative survival.
So having established all these structural conditions of 13th century Anatolia, we can now sort of synthesize why this specific environment favored the early Ottomans over all their numerous rivals.
It really comes down to a perfect convergence of political, military, and ideological factors.
Okay, so let's tick them off. The first, and maybe the most foundational, is the one we started with: fragmentation.
The region was just so thoroughly divided into these multiple, mutually competing beyliks that no single one of them could achieve the critical mass needed to decisively crush its rivals and form a stable central state. The competition was always in flux.
Okay, second factor, their brilliant strategic choice: focus on Europe.
By shifting their expansion westward, the Ottomans completely bypassed the relentless, resource-draining internal beylik warfare over limited Anatolian territory. They found a wealthier, weaker target in the Byzantine Empire,
And this allowed them to gain massive manpower and ideological prestige.
which they then turned around and deployed back against their stronger Anatolian rivals.
And third, the catastrophic Byzantine collapse. Or, maybe more accurately, the Byzantine civil wars provided the perfect opportunity. The Byzantines were actively helping their own demise.
They really were. And the figure who just symbolizes this self-destruction is Emperor John Cantacuzenos. In his desperate struggle for the Byzantine throne, he repeatedly hired Orkhan and his growing Ottoman forces for military aid.
And the price was astronomical.
It was. He paid for 20,000 Turkish soldiers by literally robbing churches. And even worse, he promised Orkhan a fortress in Thrace on the European side.
So he didn't just invite the Ottomans across the straits for a visit, he established them there permanently.
He did. He effectively familiarized them with the imperial military roads, the strategic choke points, all the political weaknesses of his own empire. It was, frankly, geopolitical suicide.
And this whole process, this created what the sources call a new race, the Osmanlis.
A hybrid power. It combined Turkish Ghazi aggression, the Islamic spiritual focus that was fueled by the dervishes, and, crucially, converted Christian elements.
And the sources note that many of the local Greeks didn't entirely reject this new regime.
No, many were reconciled to the change because of the terrible fiscal evils and the deep corruption of the late Byzantine system.
So in a chaotic world, the Ottoman promise of security, stability, and a relatively lighter, more consistent tax burden sometimes outweighed religious or ethnic loyalty.
Their rise was made possible by that instability and the extraordinary political vacuum that was opened up by the Byzantine civil wars.
So the survival of the Ottomans wasn't just good timing, it was also a matter of superior political and social innovation.
Yes. While every beylik had access to the Ghazi ideal, only the Ottomans successfully institutionalized a system that guaranteed centralized loyalty and prevented the kind of internal fracturing that plagued all of their rivals.
And that system, the core of their political innovation, was the cooler system.
The centralized slave family administration, which became the Ottoman ruling institution, it was explicitly designed as an anti-heredity machine.
Which is radical.
It's completely radical in its logic.
Yeah.
The traditional problem in any conquering state is that your most successful generals and administrators, they gain land, they gain wealth, they establish dynasties, and eventually they challenge the center.
But the Ottoman solution was to just deny them that base of power from the very beginning.
Exactly. And they achieved this enforced loyalty and political detachment in a few ways. First, through selection. Recruiting candidates almost exclusively from outside the established Anatolian Turkish aristocracy, primarily through the devshirme from Christian families.
Second, through training.
Right. These boys were rigorously educated and indoctrinated to believe that their entire identity, their entire future, depended solely and completely on the Sultan.
And third, through the systematic exclusion of hereditary power. The system deliberately discouraged family cares among its members during their most active years.
They were forbidden from owning substantial land. They held no certain inherited position in society. And crucially, their own sons and daughters wouldn't automatically benefit from their success.
So your Grand Vizier, your provincial governors, your most powerful janissary commanders, they were all members of the Sultan's slave family, bound by personal loyalty and structural dependency.
Ancestry, previous distinction, it counted for nothing. Performance counted for everything.
It's a bureaucracy of absolute meritocracy, but it's contained within this very closed system.
Yes, and for a long time, the sons of janissaries were typically excluded from joining the corps themselves. This maintained the purity and the dependence of that central pool of recruits on the Sultan alone.
And this institutional structure also guaranteed flexibility, didn't it?
A huge amount of flexibility. While the Muslim institution, the ulema, was conservative and bound by strict interpretations of the Shariat or sacred law, the ruling institution was always more liberal, more receptive to new ideas, new devices, new methods of administration.
They often borrowed from Byzantine practice.
Constantly. And you can see this flexibility even in a really sensitive area like the imperial harem. The sources confirm that in the 14th and early 15th centuries, the legal marriages of the Ottoman rulers were purely tactical.
Not about romance.
Not at all. They were contracted with princesses from neighboring dynasties, Serbian, Byzantine, Germanian, Karaman. These were high-level diplomatic tools. They were used to maintain alliances or to symbolize a defeated party's submission within that volatile political landscape.
It wasn't until later, after they'd really consolidated their power, that the system of legal marriage lapsed in favor of just having unions with women from the harem.
Which further insulated the Sultan from any external political pressure?
So the Ottomans excelled because they mastered this hybridization. They fused the practical administration of the Byzantines with the aggressive expansion of the Ghazi ideal, and they filtered it all through this radical, centralized slave family meritocracy that promoted innovation and absolute loyalty.
They weren't simply the strongest Turkish group. They were the best organized, the most ideologically coherent, and the most politically astute group operating right on the fault line of these two collapsing empires. Their military strength, while impressive, was really secondary to their political dexterity and their institutional flexibility.
So this deep dive has really shown us that the Ottoman Empire's foundation was built on a calculated exploitation of structural weakness. It began not with massive armies, but with the intense political fragmentation of the beyliks.
The powerful ideological unification provided by the Ghazi ideal and Osman's dream.
And the strategic pivot that was only made possible by the self-destruction of the Byzantine Empire.
They leveraged their geographical position, turning what should have been a vulnerability into their greatest asset. By 1372, that strategic shift was complete. Sultan Murad I had successfully conquered Macedonia and southern Bulgaria, which gave the Ottomans a clear, preponderant position in the Balkans.
And the symbolic subjugation that followed really cemented their position. The Byzantine emperor, John Palaiologos, was forced to recognize Murad as his suzerain. He became his tributary.
And he promised to do military service in person in Murad's army, and even gave his son Manuel as a hostage. That act cemented Ottoman power in Europe, providing the solid platform for the massive empire that followed.
So the institutions that Suleiman the Magnificent would inherit centuries later, the centralized bureaucracy, the advanced land tenure and taxation systems, the meritocratic ruling institution, they all have their conceptual roots right here.
Right here, in the stability that the early Osmanis were trying to carve out of the Anatolian chaos. They were building an anti-fragile state, one designed to weather the constant shocks of that Mongol-influenced world.
You know, the narrative of the Ottoman rise is so often simplified. It's told as a tale of relentless religious invasion, but the sources really reveal a far more complex reality. The earliest stages involve surprising elements of local compromise, of astute political alliances, and even that initial perfect amity with their neighbors at Seljuk.
Which brings us to a final thought.
Yeah, the provocative thought here is that for a small pastoral group of just 400 fighting men to succeed and eventually rule 3 continents, peaceful, pragmatic coexistence with their local populations may have been just as essential to their foundation as the dream of holy war that defined their later conquests. It was their ability to be both pragmatist and ideologue that truly made the difference.